Welcome. My name is Josh Schneps. I'm the publisher of Brownstoner. We're thrilled today to have two great panelists to talk about how to sell and buy, trading up to get more space. It's going to be an informative webinar. Again, if you have questions, please use the chat and Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We're here to answer them and hopefully address all the questions that you may have. And I'm going to go through it and moderate. I want to thank our sponsors and panelists, of course. Our sponsors are Compass and Lustrin, Tettleman, Adler, LLP. Hopefully you'll find this as informative as I hope that it will be. And I think we'll start off by just having our panelists introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Amanda?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda McAvena. I work at Compass. And prior to Compass, I had spent a number of years at Corcoran. And prior to that, was in the advertising and marketing industry for close to a decade. I specialize in residential sales and help a lot of people with this topic. So this is very near and dear to my heart.
Terrific. Well, thank you for being here, Amanda. And Larry.
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Larry Adler with the law firm Lustrin, Tettleman, Adler. So I am one of the partners here. We are a full-service transactional law firm, but we focus primarily on real estate. And my practice focuses pretty much exclusively on the residential real estate. I've been practicing for 10 years now, and been doing this since right out of law school. And so doing this, buying and selling real estate in and around the city is my all day, every day. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So a lot of great experience here. Amanda, let's start with you. You've worked with obviously numerous sellers transitioning from one home to the next. So can you give us a little context? What are you seeing out there in terms of people wanting to trade up, and what are some of the challenges right now?
Yeah, so the main challenge right now is really we have a bit of a lack of inventory. I think coming out of the pandemic, one of the things everyone's now requesting is another room. So this additional home office, this additional space is so critical, and it is in short supply. So we're not seeing that many 3 bedrooms on the market. If you're looking in like the prime areas within Brooklyn, Park Slope, Prospect Heights, Brooklyn Heights, Carroll Gardens, there's just very limited supply. Personally, the thing I'm seeing a lot is my sellers are trying to figure out where they go next. So I think that's kind of creating this supply issue. They're ready to list and they're willing to sell. They just don't know where their next move might be, which I think is holding up some of the inventory. So I think that's really our main challenge. And, you know, in general, there's a shortage of townhouses too. So it's the bigger properties where we're seeing these constraints.
What would you say homeowners should think about in terms of planning if they want to trade up?
There is a lot of steps in the process. I know it can feel overwhelming when you're trying to navigate how to buy and sell when you have this sort of contingency potential. But I think the first conversation should be, you know, really looking at your financials and seeing, do you have to buy or do you have to sell your current place to buy the next one? Like that's the first step, is to just understand, are you going to have a sales contingency, or can you, potentially carry 2 homes for a little bit? I think that's number one. And then, number 2 is getting your property ready. And that's really where I come in, and I can walk through with people and create a pretty, depends on the property. It could be a big or small checklist, but that's really the next step. And then starting to make all those updates and tweaks. I find if people can just get their space ready, then it makes the process a lot easier, but that's really the starting point. And then of course, looking and seeing what's out there and feeling comfortable with knowing where you can transition to.
Anything different in terms of that thought process in the current market?
In the current market, yes, I do think it's taking longer to find the property that you want to move to, because you're facing maybe more competition. Most of the properties that I'm talking to people about that are like larger 2 or 3 bedrooms are getting multiple bids, and it's hard to win a highest and best. You can't win every time, or most people don't win their first one. It might take a couple tries. So I am working with a lot of people right now that are searching sort of as a preliminary search, and then getting their apartment ready. So not listing it, but doing all that prep work now. So it's like you can kind of look for a while, feel comfortable with what's out there. And then, once you find something that you really love, then we can like really step up the whole listing process. But yeah, I would give people, I would say most people should take a few months longer to look now versus the market maybe a couple of years ago or a year and a half ago.
Good advice. Well, Larry, what about you? What options are available if a homeowner wants to sell and buy simultaneously?
Sure. So it's really great to put your team together in place right away. I've had a lot of times where a client will come to us and just to step back so everyone knows, the lawyer typically gets involved once an offer is accepted, be it on the buy side or the sell side. And so we're just sort of waiting in the background. But it really is important when they come to us, right? Are they coming to us with an accepted offer for a buy or an accepted offer for a sale? Because that really changes the equation and the dynamic. When we're looking for a sale, or we're starting with a sale, a lot of times buyers are saying, well, I'm not ready to leave my place. And so we're then talking about options for, okay, how long can we keep you in there and what can we do in the contract and going through the process there. Whereas when we're buying, it's a lot of those questions that Amanda mentioned about, and being honest with yourself. Do we need to sell? Can we carry both places? How do we time this up? Do we need the money from the sale in order to buy it? So that's why having the team in place and kind of keeping as much consistency between buy side and sell side, between your attorney, your broker, really, really helps that process.
And if you're buying and selling at the same time, what are things that people have to think about from the contract point of view?
Absolutely. So closing dates are always very important. New York does not use firm closing dates. People don't realize that, especially from out of state. Even just across the river in New Jersey, you pick a closing date, and that's usually the closing date right from the beginning. In New York, because we have co-ops and condominium boards, and banks as well, usually, we don't know. And so we're using target dates. And so we're really trying to best guess that practice. And so it's really trying to put things in each contract to protect you from the other one, even when they're typically unrelated parties, right? Your buyer is not the same as your seller usually. And so really making sure we're balancing each of those and figuring out what's important for that client. Do we need the money from the sale in order to buy? Can we bridge both of them? Do we not want to move? Do we have a place to go, right? A lot of our clients these days, fortunately, have had places out east to go to, and so they can kind of hang out in West Hampton while they're waiting on the buy to close, but that's not everybody, of course. So really figuring that out.
It's almost like expect the unexpected and make sure you have it in the contract.
Very much so, very much so. And let's be flexible. And I often tell people, contracts, while important, are just guideposts, right? When they're just pieces of paper until a lawsuit starts and a judge enforces it. So I get a lot of clients who are saying, but this is what the contract says. And I said, that's right. But we need cooperation, because unless there's a lawsuit and enforcement, we're really trying to work within a framework as much as it's specific and legal, which if there's ever a lawsuit, which we're always trying to avoid on the transactional side, it's just a piece of paper.
Right. And Josh, I'll just chime in. I think there's one other strategy that Larry and I have used a few times this year that's worked really well. I actually did this personally when I was selling my apartment. We negotiated a longer closing date. So as a seller right now, you have a lot of power. There's a lot more buyers out there than there are places to purchase. So you have some room to negotiate with whoever wants to purchase your apartment. And we did longer closing dates. So we did an honor about 90-day close, which then allows the seller to extend the contract to 120 days, seller or the buyer. I mean, these honor about dates go both ways, but that allows people to give themselves maybe another month or two to look and secure a property where, they don't have to move twice then. So I think having that additional flexibility is really important. And that's something that's all negotiated when the offer is accepted.
And to that point, to kind of close it up, Amanda said a longer closing date. We're seeing so much. I literally was on the phone yesterday with the client who is in contract to sell and buy. has approval on the sale first, has a place to go, but doesn't want to. And so we've kind of used that period that Amanda's talked about. But then at the end of the day, once the co-op board was ready on the sale and we're still waiting on the buy, I got on the phone yesterday with the other attorney and I said, cards on the table, here's what we're doing. How long can you give me? Right. And so even then, it didn't matter what the contract said. How long can you give me? And hopefully that side's not watching today, but we're keeping it in our back pocket, offering to kind of pay the buyer's rent. We haven't done that yet. We're saying, how long can you give us for free? But those are kind of tricks we're keeping in our back pocket. Can we buy this from you to, buy a period of time to let us wait a little longer?
We had a few questions come in from by email, but there's a couple of questions being posted here. I don't know if Larry, if you can speak to 1031s at all.
Absolutely. So 1031s, and let me say I didn't see the question exactly. We're just saying generally speaking. Okay. So 1031s are typically not in the buy-sale world as far as moving, right? Because 1031s are commercial property, investment property. And so the buy-sale happens more when you have 1031, where you have to identify once you've sold your property. And when we say sold, we don't just mean a contract, we mean closed on the sale. So once you close on the sale of your property, you have 45 days to identify up to 3 replacement properties, and then 180 days to close on that buy. And so it's very important to find a replacement investment property on the buy side within those 45 days after closing on the sale. But that's less about trading up and more of an investment question.
Although on that point, Larry and I have done 1031 exchanges, and we've definitely represented people that have bought and sold those properties. So still something that's in our wheelhouse, and definitely an interesting opportunity at this time. Sometimes you get people that want to live, if you're seeking more space, you could buy a 2 or 3 family home, live in one of the units and rent out the other. I'm seeing folks do that today too.
And that's true. And that is eligible. If you're selling a commercial piece of property, you can actually look into a multifamily residential as long as a proportionate percentage will be rental on the buy side.
Yep.
That is an interesting opportunity, a way to play with that a little bit.
And another question that came in was, when people are looking to sell, what kind of recommendations? You touched on it a little bit earlier, but in terms of leaving a property as is versus potentially doing some painting or cosmetic changes, how do you typically look at that or advise your sellers?
Yeah, I still see the need to do the work up front. I feel like it always yields a higher number. When people come in and they're looking at a property, they start to make kind of a checklist of oh, okay, this will have to be updated or this needs to be done. And then it's reinforced during the inspection, which I find most buyers are absolutely doing. So it's definitely to the seller's benefit to put in a little bit more work up front. And from a marketing perspective, I think it can really be a game changer. Just in terms of how the photos come out and the imagery that's used, it's critical to make your property look really, just turnkey and as nice as it can, because that translates into the photos, which then will bring more people in. And then it allows us to potentially get multiple offers, or for the price to sometimes rise organically because you have a few bidders. So I think it's worth it. I always will walk through a property. I just did this with someone this morning, and we were talking about, simple things like painting the cabinets, redoing the floors. So it's minimal. We try to keep the budget as, cost effective as possible, but a few $1,000s sometimes translates into 60,000 more in the sales price. I did this for a property in Park Slope where we replaced the vanity. I picked out all new light fixtures, ordered those for my seller, had them installed, had the apartment painted. Just those updates alone were a completely different living space. So it was very well worth it. We had 7 offers on that property, and it was a smooth sale.
That's fantastic. What about larger changes? How do you typically look at those, whether it's windows or the HVAC, or obviously the big one, the kitchen and bathrooms?
Depends on the building. So an HVAC system, if it's a co-op, that's going to be a building responsibility. So that's not necessarily something I'd recommend to a seller. Windows are also a bigger undertaking. I lived in a pre-war co-op and it was landmarked. So it took us 6 months to get the permits to even replace the windows. So sometimes these projects are a long-term sort of investment. And I do work with people that are thinking of selling much farther into the future. And I'm always happy to have those conversations about, what can you do now to get you ready even a year out? But things like windows, it just depends on the condition and how bad it is. And then also, of course, like how long you want to live there. And I think timing the market's really a key factor for a lot of people. We have a strong fall market and a strong spring market. Listing in the winter months and listing in the middle of the summer is always a slower time. I don't think people get the most value if you're looking, if you're looking to really capture an audience, you want to be listed in the prime season. So that's just a whole nother thing to think about. But what I would do is just, go through, see the condition of things, and then sort of make recommendations from there. Yeah.
Another question here that potentially could be addressed to both of you that's in our Q&A here. And if anyone else has other questions, feel free to put them in there. How likely is it to find a seller willing to wait for me to sell my co-op in order to buy their place in this competitive market? I've already had one seller reject my offer because they weren't willing to wait for me to sell.
That's a tough one. It's really hard to get an offer accepted that has a sales contingency. It is very, very difficult. Not that I haven't done it and not that it's impossible. And I know Larry and I have negotiated in some cases sales contingencies, but in the last year, it's been pretty hard to do. And I think it's something that you could think about, like I could always ask, but if there's multiple bidders, which on a lot of these properties there are, your bid's just not going to compare. For me personally, when I was selling my apartment, I was putting offers out because we were in contract and the buyers were all cash. So it was a very solid deal, but we still had to close. So we still had this contingency. And even with all those things in place, I still was not the preferred buyer. So I can tell you from my own experience, it's very hard. If there's not multiple bidders, though, there's a higher chance. So it just depends on the property you're looking at.
And I guess, go ahead, Larry.
I was just going to say, from my personal experience, I did that recently in October. I bought and sold with a sale contingency. And the way I got that property was I paid way over ask. And so I bought a contingency effectively, was the way to do that. But then the other things we did to make ourselves more competitive was we put things in there to entice the seller, right? Little things like, seller, you can keep showing the place and solicit other offers if you want, but I get the right to waive that if it comes to it. That gave me a little bit more time. Once I found a buyer for my house, I waived that contingency, right? So ways to make it a little less, burdensome. And so, but admittedly, it's very hard to do, and usually you have to pay for it is the way to go to get it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you can overcompensate it with the contingency by offering a higher number. That's usually what you have to do. But I feel like if you add up the costs of maybe like moving into a rental and making it like, unfortunately you might have to move a couple times, it's still going to save you way more than overbidding. Because typically the numbers we're looking at for, these price points in Brooklyn, you might have to come up like 25, 30,000 plus to be a meaningful offer to a seller to accept a sales contingency. So I always advise people, if you can, just be non-contingent. Otherwise we'll just have to really be careful or craft an offer and just try to get it accepted. We are, in a few months going into a slower winter period. And I do find that to be maybe more of an opportunity for folks. Like if you do have this contingency, trying to get an offer accepted with that in winter months could be good timing.
I guess following that, Amanda, what would you say to someone that is looking to trade up? They put their home on the market and sell it quickly, but they can't find a place to buy. What do you kind of recommend in those situations?
Yeah, so I think in that instance, I would say, obviously like negotiate a longer close. That would be like the first thing. So try to buy yourself a little bit more time in the apartment. That way you're not having to move, but be prepared to potentially go into a temporary rental. I think that that's, because once you're in contract and you've accepted an offer, you're bound, you do have to move. These contract dates are on or about, so we can push it. But at the end of the day, like if you're not finding what you're looking for, it might be better to just step back and rent for a little bit. And there's plenty of people that have been doing that this year as well, just to give themselves a little bit more time to really think about it. And then you can make a much stronger offer when you're closed, because you'll theoretically have all the cash in the bank and you'll be able to present something that's non-contingent.
Larry, what about you in terms of tips or stories that you could share about how to smooth roadblocks that may come up, whether it be repairs or how to keep them from derailing the process of selling and buying at the same time? What kind of advice can you give on that?
Of course. So, it's really about communication. There's a certain level of distrust, of course, with the opposite party, right? You're across the table and you don't want to give everything away, but you have to expose yourself a little bit sometimes in these deals, and be honest with yourself and be honest with the other side, right? And so, like I said, we kind of been talking about it from the beginning. You really have to be clear with what you can and what you can't do, because the contract, once, as Amanda said, once you sign that contract, so for people who don't know, when you do sign a buy contract, you put down 10%, and that is held subject to any contingencies, which if you get a sale contingency, great, you're covered, but ordinarily, it's just financing, if you have one, or a co-op condo board approval. And so it's really, I can stall for you quite a bit. As I mentioned, I had that call yesterday saying, we're using the end of our time, but we're going to be honest with you. We're trying to buy and we're waiting for our co-op board interview. We're fully approved with our bank on that one. And it's not about, at that point, I spoke to the client, do you want me to do it or do you want your broker to do it? Because it's not even a lawyer thing. It's more, seller, what can you give us? Our buyer, what can you give us? And so, we certainly can smooth things out and time them up. I am negotiating one right now, which is very interesting, where the seller is selling in the same building. I'm sorry, they're buying in the same building. And they're making it in the contract saying, look, they can stay in the apartment until that buy is ready to go. And so that's called a post-closing possession, which is something we often see quite a bit, where it's seller, our buyer, we will sell to you when you need the money to buy. And if you'd like to stay in for a week, 30 days, sometimes I've done 6 months. And so that isn't always an option as well, which is, okay, we're promising you this will happen, but we do need to bridge it, and then we'll work together on the timing from there.
Yeah, I think
like a delicate act.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's delicate indeed. The one thing I'll say about that, because we have done some post-closing possessions, is you want to make sure you have a really flexible buyer. It can freak people out because they're exposing themselves a little bit. They're taking on more risk on the buy side. So it works. In my experience negotiating those, you certainly want to have your apartment be a very desirable apartment, because the first buyer might not agree to that. Like I've had apartments I've sold where I've received multiple offers and said, we'd like post-closing possession. The seller wants to stay in the apartment, and people have said, no, no, we're not agreeing to that. So it helps you as the seller to make sure you do all the right things with preparing your home and pricing it correctly. So it gives a little bit more leverage to negotiate.
It's true. We hate it as buyer's attorneys when I'm on that side, because you are allowing someone to stay in your apartment with only a small amount of money held in escrow and a lot of liability, right? If the prior owner does something to damage that apartment, the buyer is the one dealing with it. And so it's delicate and also buyers usually want to move into their new place. And so they hate that too.
Yep.
So, Amanda, we've seen some explosive growth in terms of values of homes, some rising 40% or more in the last year. Where do you see the market and interest rates going in the next year or two in Brooklyn particularly, and how might that affect the trading up process?
Right. It's very hard to predict the future of the market. So I can tell you a little bit in terms of what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks with the fall market is that it's still continuing to be really, really strong. I think there's a few factors. A lot of offices have said they are reopening or they have reopened, things are sort of resuming in the city. So people, especially in the rental market's been really competitive, but a lot of people moved back around the same time. So we're seeing competition. I think we'll continue to see a lot of competition. On the interest rate front, I would want to put people in touch with a lender, and there's several I work with that are all incredible, and they look at the rates all day, every day. And I think that interest rate sort of variable is the one thing that could change how competitive things get into the next year, because the rates are so low, people want to purchase, they can buy a larger space, because I'm seeing rates in 2.6, 2.7, those ranges, which, you could maybe even negotiate a lower rate depending on sort of your financial situation, but it's a great time to buy, from that perspective. But if rates all of a sudden jump up and get into the mid threes, then people's ranges in terms of what they can afford is a different thing. And we're also, I think, a little bit constrained by the supply. So with COVID, a lot of the development projects were shut down and they couldn't build, and that's restarted, but there's still a lot of supply chain issues with people getting appliances, with wood coming in, with labor even being able to find people that will do the work. So I think that slowed down our inventory, and it's anyone's guess what could happen next year. I'm not going to even try to predict the market, but I can tell you right now, if you're a seller, this is one of the best times to be selling. We're kind of at a high because it's all supply and demand within the market. There's limited supply, and there's a lot of people that need a home and are looking for a larger home. So I've had some sellers come to me and they've just said, I just want to put my place on the market. I'm going to rent, but I at least want to capture this moment in time because they know it's a good opportunity. So I think that, that's a good way to maybe think about things right now. And then I don't know if there'll be a correction. And I will say, in these prime parts of Brooklyn, values don't really go down. I mean, in 2008, they ticked down a little bit, but then they were back up there in a couple of years. So, if you're looking to buy, I also wouldn't try to time it. Your home is your biggest asset for most people. So if you find something you like and it can work and you plan to be there 5-7 years, I think that's what you should be thinking about. I think if you're trying to time it, you might miss out because you might see the values continue to go up and then you might not be able to get that apartment you want. So that's my perspective on things.
That's great. But what about some up and coming neighborhoods in Brooklyn? What would you say if someone's looking for maybe something outside of the more established neighborhoods? Are there any neighborhoods that you would recommend or that you work in that you could touch on?
Absolutely. I really am a fan of Greenwood, which is just south of Park Slope. That's a neighborhood that's been developing quite a bit. There's been a lot of building down there. The apartment sizes tend to be a bit bigger. So there's quite a few folks that have been looking for something in Park Slope. They haven't found it. So they've gone south to Greenwood and they've found something that's a lot more space. Windsor Terrace is another really good option. That neighborhood also will afford 2 or 3 bedrooms, and it's near the park. So it's very convenient for a lot of people. And then Crown Heights, which is another neighborhood, seen a lot of development and just some really, they still have this historic district. So folks that have wanted maybe Park Slope or Prospect Heights, Carroll Gardens, Brownstones, have looked in the historic district in Crown Heights, and you see almost the same style of property. So I would recommend that. And then lastly, Prospect Lefferts Gardens. That's another neighborhood that I think is just a beautiful, tree-lined streets, still near the park. still developing and changing, but has a lot of potential and also has more inventory for larger houses. And it's not so high yet. You can still secure a house there for certainly under 3 million. I had some clients that recently bought this beautiful, completely like renovated, but with original detail, which I think is very hard to find.
Yeah.
Property in Prospect Lefferts Gardens, and their price point was 2.4. So it's an affordable neighborhood and still very close to the park and a lot of great neighborhood amenities too.
And we've seen a lot of multi-family houses as well, which always have that nice investment opportunity, right, to get those, trading up and carrying that cost by factoring in a little rent. And so we've also, on the legal side, negotiated and reviewed lease and done tenant agreements as well to kind of help ease that transition a bit too.
Do you also help with when you purchase a property if there are already renters in the property?
Absolutely.
Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, and we both do. But from my standpoint, I very much had, our basic clause says the property will be vacant, room clean, and free of tenants. And obviously, that's not always the case. And we've had sellers who've said you're taking subject to this tenant, and we've had quality tenants and not quality tenants. And so for me, I always tell the buyers if they can, one, we must review the lease, right? Let's see the lease. Let's get a rental history. Let's see who's been there. And I often tell my buyers a little sneakily, because I don't think the sell side always loves it, knock on the door. Go say hi, right? Say hi to that tenant. Get a sense of that person, because especially for our people who are going to be living in the house, you're going to be living with someone downstairs. That is not only your tenant, it's your neighbor.
Good advice.
Yeah. In those instances too, we've done the inspection when the tenants have been home. So just by nature of being in the building and inspecting their apartment, you do get to meet them. And you always want to do an inspection. I recommend it for everyone who's buying. And you do that before you sign the contract. So that's a good opportunity to meet this potential tenant before you sign and before things are finalized.
There's a bunch of questions here about financing, and I know that's not really what you guys do, your expertise, but question perhaps maybe better framed is, how competitive can you be when you've already sold and have cash versus, potentially being a buyer in this market where you could put down 10 or 20%? I mean, with what you're saying of the sellers being more in command of the market right now, how has that impacted, buyers when they come to the plate with less money down or more money down when they make offers?
Right. Yeah, I'll start with this one. I'm sure, Larry, you've got some insights, but the best thing for any seller is if, they receive an all cash offer, because we don't have to worry about the bank. We don't have to worry about an appraisal. The process can move a lot faster because you're not waiting on that commitment letter for the buyers to come in. So sellers always prefer cash. It's like the best if you can get it. So if you are an all cash buyer, I find it doesn't always get you like a lower price, unless there's no other offers. But if it's an all cash offer versus a financing offer, the seller is always going to choose the cash. So it will get you preference, that's for sure. And if you can put more down, the better, because then to the seller, you're less of a risk. So in some instances, say there's a shortfall on the appraisal, which means it's 2.5, but the appraiser values it at 2.4. Well, there's $100,000 difference. So as a buyer, you have to make up the gap. And there's contingencies we always put in contracts for people, of course, but say you're putting 30% down or 40% down, it doesn't matter if there's a shortfall because the bank's lending you the same amount of money anyway. You're still putting down that much cash. So the sellers always love to see a little bit more down, just because it's more likely the deal will go through and things will be smooth. Yeah.
Anything, Larry, you want to add to that, or anything you're seeing?
Sure. Yeah. So, for me, it's all about papering that up and making sure that's properly reflected. I always tell my buyers that my philosophy when I go into these contracts is I want you to buy the place. But importantly, as I said before, you put down 10% when you sign, and I want to protect that 10% at at all costs, right? So there's always a way to get that back, which the less contingencies you have, the harder that is to happen. And so what I will do is when Amanda will come to me and say, this is so competitive, our buyer needs that 80% financing, but they're taking a risk. We talk about it, right? And we try to build in options, right? If the first bank turns us down, give me time to go to another bank. We try to do that a lot. We put in clauses that say, look, fine, we'll take a 70% contingency, but let me go for 80, Mr. Seller. And that puts an expectation that, okay, I really do need the money. And so really trying to work that problem, because the one thing we haven't seen is that the appraisers are late to this game, right? And so more than ever before, we've been seeing low appraisals because the nature of an appraiser is he looks at past sales. And so in a rising market, right, you're not on up to where we are. And so it really is a challenge to work that and make sure we're giving buyers ample amount of time to go find financing that does work for them.
Yeah, this is great feedback. I mean, I don't know about the audience, but I think that this has been extremely informative and a ton of great information. Many of you may have other questions. I want to let you know that we will be emailing you not just a link to the video, but a contact information for both Larry and Amanda. So unless Larry and Amanda, you have anything else that you want to touch on or bring up, I want to thank you both for your time. I found it very interesting and informative, and it's a huge investment that people are making, and thank you for helping them along with the process. So again, I want to thank Amanda with Compass Real Estate and Larry with Lustrin, Tettleman, Adler, LLP. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a great afternoon.
All right. Bye.
Thanks.